Okay, so we're up and running now. Yeah, yes, while we're on confessions, I ought to say that I'm not an expert on the Baltic Sea region at all. And I have done a few publications about resilience, but I wouldn't really call myself a resilience scholar. However, the work that I've done on infrastructure history, particularly to do with Berlin, means that I'm inevitably confronted, thanks to Berlin's turbulent history and the significance of infrastructure, inevitably connected to issues of resilience and vulnerability. And I've had a look through the call for papers for the conference, and I see lots of points of resonance with what I'm talking about. So I'm sort of confident I can tick a lot of the buttons there. I think there are two things that I really want to sort of push in my talk today. And one is I want to introduce you to this infrastructural lens on resilience. You know, what can this focus on infrastructure tell us about resilience? And perhaps the other way around, what can resilience tell us about infrastructure? That's the first one. And the second one, which Sebastian kindly was referring to, is the importance of historicizing resilience. So how can we mobilize past in certain ways that it doesn't just provide context and background to what we're doing today, but can actually get us rethinking how we approach today's challenges in a new way, okay? So those are the two main sort of thrusts of my talk. And I'll be doing this with a lot of empirical data about Berlin. So hopefully you'll learn a bit about Berlin, even the Berliners amongst you. And I've heard there are quite a few Berliners in there who often commute here every now and again. So we know who you are. And even you hopefully will learn a fair bit of new things about Berlin, because it's quite surprising what went on there. Okay? So, and it builds very much on my research that I've done, the book, which Sebastian very kindly advertised, but also this recent project about usable paths. And I'll come back, hence the subtitle there, Berlin's Usable Paths. I'll come back to that shortly. Okay, so let's kick off with what I want to do. I want to structure my talk in this way. I'll start off by talking about this relationship between resilience and infrastructure. Okay, what does this lens on infrastructure give us? I'll then talk about history as an experiential resource. That's the way I like to talk about it, as a resource of thinking things afresh, particularly resilience. So two sort of more conceptual bits there. And that's the kind of framing for the empirical part. And I deliberately picked two very, very different empirical foci for looking at resilience in Berlin's history. One is very much a big story about keeping electricity going in West Berlin during the Cold War, sort of massive geopolitical disruption, what that meant. And the next one is something very, very small about a small, apparently redundant water technology. And I'm deliberately using the large technical system and some very small technology to show you the breadth of importance of infrastructures there. And then I'll draw some lessons from those two cases on infrastructural resilience, and then close with some more broader reflections on what that means for resilience research altogether. And I'll stick my neck out there, even if I'm not a proper resilience scholar. Okay, so let's kick off then. Resilience in infrastructure. What's special about infrastructures? Well, I think they are definitely, they provide essential services. So keeping them going is pretty obvious. That's really, really important. My own work has been on water and energy infrastructures, but equally, obviously, transport infrastructures, IT infrastructures are also significant. Their network functionality is really important because infrastructures have this characteristic of being hubs. They connect natural resources to technologies, to ways of using them. They connect, the light socket in your home to urban plans for energy transitions, to global the geopolitics of energy. Okay, so spatially they connect a lot. They connect a lot also between the past, the present, and the future, as we will discover as well. So that network functionality is really, really significant to them, makes them really important for resilience. Also, they're incredibly interdependent. Yeah, we need a lot of electricity. We need electricity to provide our water supply system. Yeah, we used to need a lot of coal to do this. Today, fortunately, very little. We need our IT systems to function, for electricity to function, and so on. So if there are problems in any part of that network, if there are vulnerabilities in there, they can set off so-called cascading failures from one infrastructure system to another. That's what's meant by interdependency. We have obviously a material embeddedness of this infrastructure that you see when you go down a street and see people repairing this stuff. It's really the substructure of our cities are these infrastructure systems. And partly for that reason, we talk a lot about the path dependence of infrastructure, yeah? How very difficult it is to change them. But I will argue also this path dependence is not just material in nature, because we have these water pipes or sewers or whatever that are there. They're also very much institutional, they're political, they're in our minds as well, about how we think about infrastructures. So I think it's quite helpful when we're talking about resilience to think of infrastructure and resilience in two ways. It's partly the resilience of infrastructures. So it's protecting infrastructures from attack, from vulnerability, from floods, from drought or whatever. Here's a rather dramatic picture. Can you actually put the light down at the front here maybe, so we can see these images a bit better? Because there's some really, yeah, can you have a go? And what you can't see so well here is a picture in Singapore of a water reservoir being protected, and the sign there is actually showing somebody being shot. So if you go through that fence, you'll actually be shot trying to get in there. So the protection of infrastructures is really important there. The other side is resilience through infrastructure. How infrastructures are important to make our own living resilient altogether. So securing these reliable, accessible and affordable core functions that we know are so essential. And here you see a sort of reassuring, oh, that's much better, thank you very much. It's a reassuring image of a man controlling some high-tech stuff, making sure that we get our water supply. So, and this is why we talk a lot about critical infrastructure. That's come into the sort of German vocabulary since the 2000s. In the US, it's been there since the Clinton administration, talking about the importance of protecting, of defining certain infrastructures as critical. A lot of us came across that obviously in COVID, maybe for the first time. Defining them as critical and supporting them with all sorts of policy instruments and material support as well. I think from a social science perspective, it's interesting to look at resilience in infrastructures in terms of the various differences involved there, and sort of getting beyond this notion of resilience being something that's only material. So there are differences in dimension, I would suggest. So it's not just material resilience, so that's important too. It's also institutional, political. So infrastructures understood as socio-technical systems also comprise, regulatory regimes, they comprise financing mechanisms, they comprise social practices of how they're used and whatever. So all of these are critical when it comes to vulnerability and making things resilient. There are differences in positionality as well that Clements was indicating. So it depends on where you are. I wrote a paper with one of the few papers I read about resilience was with a colleague. We called it, "Your Resilience is My Vulnerability." And it was about a conflict over a small river. And it was trying to express the notion that measures to make upstream users of that river resilient actually created all sorts of new vulnerabilities for downstream users. Okay, a very simple notion there. That's what I mean by positionality. Differences in interpretation. There's a classic sort of cause célèbre there in the energy sector. There was a big blackout in Europe in 2003, and the European grid, as you may well know, is a trans-European grid, so we're almost all connected, almost all EU countries are connected. And because there was this blackout, it had an immediate effect on lots of countries across Europe. So it was criticized by policymakers and the media as being an example of the vulnerability of having interconnectedness. And yet the grid operator said, no, you're wrong. It's actually an example of resilience, because within a couple of hours, we had the whole system up working again. And we could only do that because of this trans-European network. So there you had the same system was regarded by one group of people as being completely vulnerable because it affected the whole of Europe, or a lot of Europe. The other group of people, the grid operators, said, no, it actually proved, it proved it was really, really good and really resilient because we had it back up and running within a few hours rather than several days, okay? And there are differences over time, of resilience. Importing gas from Russia was seen in the 1990s, to remind you, as a good idea. Do you remember Wandel durch Handel? There was this whole idea, and there was a talk about it being a resilience policy. It was about European security. Buying gas from Russia was a good idea to draw Russia in to the European economic model. Well, of course, after the latest after the full-scale model of invasion of Ukraine, that was revealed to be very short-sighted indeed. So these differences can change over time. I'm going to move to the second point now. History as an experiential resource. And for many of the crises that we're facing now, I think challenges, we often don't look to history for interesting lessons, for things to learn from there. On the contrary, we often look to the future. There's almost a desperate craving for something new to resolve the complex problems we're facing now. And by craving the new, there's this sense we have to ditch the old, that there's no solutions in the past, yeah? And I've picked up these three solutions, which I think are lovely in their own little way. On the bottom left is the high-tech strategy of the German federal government, which is all about innovation. You know, you measure, you literally, it's a yardstick, you measure your creativity, your ability to cope with problems by the degree of innovation that you have there. The one on the bottom right is from the transitions towns movement that you may be familiar with, and that's a sort of idea that we just need to transition from one state to another. And this is so graphically put, I think, here, this notion of rolling out a beautiful, bright, green future, which is literally covering over the past, this dirty past, you know, with all the cars and all the rest. And then on the top right, you have Fridays for Future, with this notion of having a huge system transformation being required. And the underlying theme behind a lot of this is that the past is the problem. The past is the problem, and therefore we shouldn't look to the past for any kind of solutions, because it is the problem. And there's no debating the fact that the mess we're in today has resulted from a lot of decisions in the past, and actions and structures and laws that have happened in the past, of course. But that does not mean that the past is devoid of any kind of interesting lessons to inspire and challenge us to think in creative ways for the future. And that's what I want to talk about now. And this is also this kind of thinking of looking to the future is reflected in my own field of infrastructure studies. And I've just picked out a couple of prominent publications here, which is all about future-proofing infrastructures. Because future-proofing is effectively a kind of resilience, yeah? It is preparing infrastructures for future challenges. What's really interesting about both these books, they don't refer to the past at all. They don't refer to the past at all. I picked up this one of Linda Samuel's book, which is a great read. I mean, and all the things that she points out that we need for future-proofing infrastructure. So she talks about a next-generation infrastructure. It's multifunctional, it's public, it's visible, it's socially productive, it's locally specific and flexible, and it's all these wonderful things. And I agree completely with all of them. Where I disagree with her is the implicit notion that this is all new. Believe me, it is not all new. Just for Berlin, I could go down this whole list of 11 and cite you lots of examples for one single city of these things that existed in the past, where it has been public, where it has been visible, where it has been driven by designers. So technologically smart, okay, perhaps not, depends how you define technologically smart. But everything else, I can give you lots of examples. So it gives us some indication that we need to consider the past. And I just wanted to include this lovely critique by David Edgerton, who is a very prominent historian of technology, who says that present visions of the future display a startling, unself-conscious lack of originality. We think we're being so cool and so creative and so new. In actual fact, we're thinking along the old lines as we always have. And the past is, if at all, considered in these futures debates in a rather selective manner. Sometimes to highlight system obduracy, so this notion of path dependency, we're stuck thanks to the past. So it's very, very difficult to change things. So it's almost the blame game about the past again. Or else it's to justify particular futures. So it's a cherry picking bits from the past that kind of fit what you're talking about now, where you want to go. You cherry pick that bit without referring to the context and everything else that was around it and say, well, that's, look at the past, we did this in the past. Or thirdly, to argue for continuity, which is basically saying we don't need to do very much, it's sorted out in the past, so we'll sort it out in the future, so we don't need to get very excited about it. And I think what a lot of this misses the capacity of history to remind, to provoke, to inspire, to challenge, to debunk some of the myths that we have, and to excite us as well. And so I'm using this concept of usable past, and lots of people have been using that in the last sort of 20 years. Usable past in the sense of enrolling and critically appraising knowledge of the past to help us navigate present and future challenges, basically, if I could sort of put that in a nutshell. But I think the usable past of infrastructure can do a lot of different things. They can reveal the variety of past possibilities, so get us away from thinking about universalisms and master narratives. They can debunk notions of linear development trajectories. A lot of infrastructure trajectories are often told in a kind of linear technological development. In reality, there's a lot of re-emergence, disappearance, reversals, which is really important if you're talking about transitions. We can observe technologies in use over time, because the way they're used often differs hugely from the way the people who designed them thought they would be used. And history can help us to explain how they were used in different ways, perhaps. They can help us uncover discarded or hidden alternatives. You know, the alternative technologies or practices that were maybe decried for being inferior, in quote, but perhaps they were discarded for other reasons, for political reasons, owing to power relations, colonialism, or whatever, yeah? We can study then the hybridization of the old and the new. This is David Edgerson's thing. He's really keen on looking how the new does not simply supplant the old, but you need to understand that as well. So, you know, think of smart meters, often sold as something totally new. If you're designing a smart meter system and you don't think about the existing historically established grid we have for electricity and the way we produce electricity, you're going to run into massive problems in rolling out your smart meters, however smart they are. There's a shift, you need a shift in focus from invention and implementation, nothing against that in itself, to issues of maintenance and adaptation. And that was a point that Clements was talking as well in terms of resilience. Really important research coming out in infrastructure now about adaptation and maintenance. They highlight various common constraints that one may confront and sensitize us to contingency and ambivalence. So contingency as an opportunity and how these contingent opportunities in the past have been seized or not been seized and what we can learn from that. Okay, and Sebastian mentioned this new project. This is what we're trying to capture this in a kind of co-creative way. I can talk about this maybe a bit later in the discussion. Because we deliberately, provocatively chose this title, Past-Proofing Infrastructure Futures, in order perhaps to irritate in a positive way engineers who like to talk about future-proofing their infrastructures. So it's about checking on the past. Before you look at the futures, check on the past. What can you learn from the past to inform the ideas for the futures? And if you're interested, do have a look at our website. This is our website there. And I just want to say something about our German motto that translates really badly into English. It's really nice that German does something better than English every now and again, you know, which is nicht nur über die Geschichte nachdenken, sondern mit der Geschichte umdenken. It's this umdenken. It's the umdenken. That's the bit you can't translate into English, unfortunately. So apologies if you don't speak German, just learn it, yeah. Okay, right, enough of the let's talk now about the empirical evidence that I want to amass to make this argument and give it some substance anyway. And the first one is about resilient electricity for West Berlin. So this is a classic issue of geopolitical conflict. And I'll give you this iconic graph that was used in the 1950s to explain West Berlin's predicament. And you can see some, it's really dramatic with almost like a cliffhanger wall going around the edge of West Berlin. This is the divide between West and East Berlin. What you can see here are the divided electricity cables. Can you see them up there? And they're cut off. Because what a lot of people don't know, the blockade of West Berlin in 1948 actually began when the Soviet authorities instructed the load dispatcher to cut all the connections of electricity between West Berlin and East Germany and East Berlin, okay? That's how it started. And so Berlin's infrastructures were an immediate conduit of the emergent Cold War and Berlin's predicament there. So what was that crisis? How did it start before we go into the resilience responses? Well, the physical one, where coal supplies were stopped during the blockade, so no coal coming into West Berlin at all for those 11 months. You had the power grid truncated along the border, as I mentioned, and this just shows sort of a technical plan I found in the archives, which shows the way it was cut off. This is the way it sort of gets depoliticized in a way. This is the map which shows electricity being cut off from West Berlin. It looks so neutral, but it's these bits that are cut off in the middle, these crosses, that indicate something really, really world-moving. Also, organizationally, we had the power utility, municipal power utility called BEWAG, was divided between a BEWAG West and BEWAG Ost, basically, and here you have a letter from one of the British commanders complaining about the sacking of the BEWAG in the eastern part of the city, and he retained his position in the west, so you have an organizational divide there as well, important to know. What were the emergency responses, the immediate responses? Well, many of you will know the response in the airlift was the airlift. to West Berlin for that period of the blockade, from June 48 to May 49. What a lot of people don't know is that 2/3 of the tonnage in those planes was not food, it was coal. And almost all of that coal went straight to the power stations, went straight to the gas works, because gas was being produced locally there. Okay, and hence this quote from who was then the councillor, later governing mayor of Berlin, Ernst Reuter: every kilowatt hour of electricity, every cubic meter of gas, and every litre of water which is taken from our supply pipes cost coal, and new coal can only be provided by air. Okay, so massive intrusion in these essential supplies, leading to the rationing of electricity. You see on the right, it was rationed to 2 hours in the day and 2 hours at night for most of that period. This is a photograph from January 1949, with everybody dressed up in their winter gear there. The blockade ended in 1949, but that didn't end the vulnerability of West Berlin's electricity system, because it was still subject to all sorts of interruptions for the coal coming in by barge and by rail as well. So this image, which I show you again, shows you this strategy, the resilient strategy, the longer term one, of creating an electricity island out of West Berlin, the Strominsel West Berlin, which became a really powerful narrative, but also to some extent a reality as well. And the idea was, we're going to have like a circular economy system, urban autarky in electricity generation, generate all West Berlin's electricity on site in the territory, hence all the networked power stations and grid system within West Berlin altogether, because this image is from 1952, okay? So how did they do that? How did they pursue urban autarky in power supply? And I should emphasize, it's not urban autarky in energy, because obviously the coal had to be imported. That was really important. Well, once they are building up supply capacity, so here you have a classic sort of infrastructure building model with lots of new power blocks for all the various power stations being built up over time, with a 17% reserve that was required by the Allies to avoid a repeat of the blockade. You had developing storage capacity. Those of you who lived in Berlin in the 80s, West Berlin, will be familiar with the term the Senatskohlenreserven. I can remember them now. They were all over the place, huge piles of coal, which apparently had a nasty habit of self-igniting in hot summers, which was quite worrying from a vulnerability point of view. Increasing system flexibility. This is a great thing in the back of the Charlottenburg power station, which is a gas storage facility, which is actually used for short-term electricity generation, which was really good for helping balance the load, because you had like a city, it was like a city grid. It wasn't connected to anything else. So you needed to have load management, had to be conducted within the half city of Berlin. Also interesting, exploiting synergies between different infrastructures. What you can't really see here, it's an advert for district heating. Because you had all these inner city power stations, the thinking was, if we have all these power stations, why not make them combined heat and power? Yeah? And if you have combined heat and power, then you can use the heat to heat up Berlin's homes. So there's a real boost in district heating in West Berlin, produced with combined heat and power, which is why in Berlin altogether, we have a really interesting legacy of lots of district heating, about 30% plus district heating, which is proving very beneficial now when we're talking about decarbonizing our heating systems, not with gas hopefully, but with something that's of a more renewable nature, because we already have these thanks to the situation. So, amazingly, by 1956, West Berlin did become self-sufficient with its electricity generation. I emphasize electricity, yeah? Which is an amazing achievement, and it remained so till the fall of the Berlin Wall. So you might think, well, yeah, job well done. That's great, you know, resilient strategy paid off, end of story. But it wasn't, because this was the sort of external image of the Strominsel Berlin. What was happening behind the scenes was very, very different, and you only get that with some archival research. You see all sorts of wobblies on the way. All sorts of wobblies. One of this was about the idea they're getting so desperate about the need to generate more power in West Berlin. They were getting so worried about the problem of importing coal that they thought it would be a good idea to go nuclear, to build a nuclear power plant in West Berlin. Yeah? And this was being planned both in the 1960s and in the 1970s. You can see it even got out to the Bild-Zeitung. So a Geheimplan, Atomkraftwerk an der Spree, so a secret plan, there's going to be an atomic power station. They decided not to do it eventually because of the risk of popular protests in the 70s, but the plans were really quite well developed. Another one was battery storage, which didn't get built until 1984. Turned out to be the world's largest battery, only possible in West Berlin, with a lot of funding coming in from the Americans and Bonn as well, of course. But this was about it to increase resilience against power shortage as well. So sort of technological advancement. And you can actually visit this building now. It's an old Energiemuseum, it is now, in the back of the Steglitz power plant. Alternative fuels. They actually did switch quite a lot from coal to oil as a fuel for generating electricity, which is really unusual in Western Europe. As I say, the West German average was only 2% of electricity generation at the time was from oil. West Berlin upped it to 25%. Why did they do that? Because the oil had a smaller volume than coal, therefore was easier to transport. All about minimizing that vulnerability on East Germany. And even this, the big thing that they weren't meant to think about at all, importing electricity from East Germany, was being considered all the way through from the 1960s. So while they were saying outside, Strominsel West-Berlin, wir schaffen das allein, we're doing it alone, behind the scenes they were scrambling for opportunities, looking for possibilities, if it would be possible to arrange to import electricity to minimize this requirement to build lots of power stations, because there were all sorts of limits to this ideal. There was a lot of pollution, air pollution from all these power stations. There were increasing protests. You can see this is a poster from 1976 against plans to build a huge 1.2 megawatt power station in the Spandauer Forst. They were planning on building, they had 12 power stations already, they were planning on building another 12 within the confines of West Berlin. 24 power stations. So there are obvious limits here altogether. So they began negotiations with the GDR, Poland, the USSR, and the Federal Republic from the 1950s onwards. And the idea behind this was, if we negotiate with the Soviet Union and with the People's Republic of Poland, then it's going to be much harder for the East Germans to interrupt the supply of electricity, because then they would be reducing the revenue going to the People's Republic of Poland or to the big brother of the Soviet Union. So the idea was, if we import electricity not from West Germany but from these other countries, it'll make it a more resilient strategy. Okay, and you got this lovely cartoon here showing the Deutsche Michel looking a bit sort of skeptical about being connected with a hammer and sickle to the Soviet electricity. Okay, there's all sorts of parallels, aren't there, to the gas situation now, which are a bit disconcerting. And so they came up with these ideas, and this is what you find in the archives. This is from 1974, yeah? Plans for the unacceptable, acceptable, and optimal connections to West Berlin from different countries. And what's obvious in the diagrams, the more connections there are, like 3 here rather than 1 here, the more resilient the city will be from intervention from the East Germans. However, the situation was so fraught that it was only in 1988 that they actually agreed to import electricity in. 1988, rings a bell. It was the year before the wall fell. So there was no actual connection between East and West before 1989. So the West Berliners could still claim, we had the Strominsel West-Berlin survived to the end, but it was blinking tight towards the end, and the connections only came later altogether. Okay, so a really interesting example with electricity here of how a resilient situation, there was an immediate reaction, and then the resilient solution, in this case the electricity island, was not permanent, was continuously being revisited in the light of changing circumstances and new limitations. That's what the message from that particular story. Okay, let me come on to the next one, which is a very different story. Something really small and cute almost. The street water pump. Those of you who've lived in Berlin, those of you who know Berlin will encounter these street water pumps a lot, because there are quite a lot of them. There are actually over 2,000 of them. At the last count, there were 2,091, okay? This is an open street map of just the central part of Berlin, and every green dot is one of those street water pumps. Now, these were built for providing drinking water for Berliners. So why are there so many still there now? Over 2,000. And why are they there at all? Why haven't they gone? In all other cities, they've disappeared, like decades, if not 100 years ago. Yeah? Berlin got its central water supply, not relying on this, in 1856. Now, it took several decades for that to work out, but by the end of the 19th century, most houses had running water. So why are these things still there? Well, that's the story about the resilience of this technology, but also how about why they've been important for different elements of urban resilience over this very long period of 150 years, because they have changed their functions. They fulfill all sorts of different functions and have done over that course of time, which meant that they are still there today. And we can be, as you will see later on, we can be really glad in Berlin that we've got them. Really glad. Okay? They're not just decor. This is what they look like. And there's all sorts of models. And what's interesting about this, I showed you this picture, because some of them are very historic. So you think, oh yeah, okay, very historic, nice and sweet, from 19th century. So they're all being protected by heritage order or something. Well, ones like this aren't being protected by heritage order at all. They're post-war design. They're post-war, so these things have been designed afresh in the post-Second World War era. Why the hell was that necessary? Only of the 2,000, only 10 are protected with a heritage protection order. 10. Yeah? So if somebody started removing them tomorrow, the Denkmalbehörde couldn't do anything except for those 10. So it's not that. That's not the reason why they're being kept. It's not for sort of museal sort of reception. It's the different functions. And the first one, obviously, was about accessing groundwater for drinking originally. Yeah? So these things that have existed for hundreds of years. And the great benefit, the great blessing for Berlin is that it has groundwater that's quite close to the surface in many parts of the fluvial basin. Sometimes it's only 2 meters below the surface, sometimes 5 meters, and some of these pumps will go down about 20 meters max. Yeah? So easy access to groundwater resources, which of course in the olden days was great for Berlin's development. However, not entirely, because it was also a curse. Because if you had some kind of sewer system close to those water pipes, of course, then you got infiltration, contamination of the groundwater. So hence that really dramatic image of death pumping water out of the street water pumps. That was, was very well known in the 19th century at that time. But there are more uses, and this is what I want to emphasize. There have been more uses over the decades. And this is a diagram that you can't see. It's really good in the original. You can't really see it very well here. It's from the archive, and what it shows is a cross-section of one of those street water pumps. Anyone who's interested in geology of Berlin gets really excited seeing all this kind of stuff here, this cross-section. But what I want to show you here is this bit here. It's a connection connected to those water pumps for the fire brigade, to enable to use those, to connect their pipes there, to use it for quenching, for fighting fires, basically. And this map is not from the 19th century, it's from 1925. It's actually from exactly 100 years ago. So even in the 1920s, when we already had the water supply, these pipes were being used, they were being redesigned for fighting fires. They were also used for refreshing humans and animals, obviously, people who didn't have access to water in their homes. And so there's a guy drinking there, quenching his thirst there. I want to draw your attention to this, though, because it's really important. You probably think this little trough at the bottom is for collecting drips from the pipe, if it leaks or something. It has another really important function why they were built. The next time you're in Berlin, look out for those troughs. It's for horses. It's so horses can drink. Because horses do not drink like that. If you've got a horse, you'll know they don't drink like that. They only drink from still water. And yet horses were the essential point of transport in the city of Berlin well into the 1930s. So if you couldn't give your horse enough to drink, and sometimes they drank up to 15 litres a day, you've got a problem with your transportation and mobility for people riding, but above all for transporting goods across the city. Okay? This is the nearest I've got. If you ever come across a historical picture of a horse drinking from one of the Berlin water pumps, I will give you probably quite a lot of money. Okay? This is the closest I've got. I've got a horse with a cart standing next to a water pump. But it's not a very good picture and it's not drinking. So anyway, that's the best you got. So, basically these things were the filling stations of their day. They're the filling station, and that's why they were kept on, and I've seen lots of newspaper articles arguing about we need more and more of these pumps, water pumps, because there are lots of horses that need them. Of course, Berlin had a lot of crises, emergency crises. You needed them then as well. This picture, you probably wouldn't recognize, it's actually taken in March 1920, and it's during the Kapp Putsch. Now, the Kapp Putsch was a right-wing putsch in Berlin, and it brought to its knees by a general strike. And in the general strike, also the water utility was involved, the electricity was involved in the general strike, and therefore the water system was not working. That's why Berliners needed to resort to these pipes. Obviously, in the Second World War, this was the same thing, a lot of destruction from aerial bombardment of the water pipes. So these, once again, these water pumps were used again for essential drinking water purposes, and also during the blockade and in the early 1950s as well in West Berlin. So you notice how these things are carrying on now into the post-war era. That's very much part of the resilience thinking, particularly in West Berlin. And this is why, actually, even today, there are many more of these pumps in the western part of the city than there are in the eastern part of the city, because it was not so important during the Cold War to maintain these pumps in operation, okay? So just to give you some stats, there are, the district of Tempelhof-Schöneberg has the greatest proportion of these street water pumps. There is one street water pump for 1,500 inhabitants, yeah? Which is like the norm, that's what it should be. In the district of Pankow in the east, it's 4,000 inhabitants per pump, yeah? And I'll come to what's happening now to improve that relationship later, okay? There are other uses that have been used that are perhaps less important, but nevertheless significant. Again, Autowaschen verboten is for washing cars. If somebody can get me a picture of somebody washing their car using water from a street water pump in Berlin, also a lot of money, not quite as much money as for the horses, but still I give you a lot of money for that. And so I've only got Autowaschen verboten, but I can remember that in the 1980s, men queuing up on a Saturday morning to try and get as close as possible with their cars to these street water pumps. No kidding. So they could wash the stuff there. And of course for kids playing as well is great. More recently, this is a really interesting one, is for watering trees. The BUND, the environmental group in Berlin, is calling on Berliners in hot summers to water trees that are suffering from drought. And you can go on this, there's even this internet site called Gieß den Kiez, where you can check the trees in your neighborhood and which ones need water, obviously the younger ones, and then you can find out where's the nearest street water pump, and you can go and pump the water and get the water, so you don't have to run upstairs to the 5th floor and drag, water down there. You've got water in the street, basically. And what's really interesting about this is it's about a community-based form of maintaining these infrastructures. Because if people don't use this infrastructure, if you don't pump it regularly, it silts up. And it's really expensive to get these things reworking if it silts up, yeah? So here it's really important for civilians to actually operate this pump in order to keep it going, in order to maintain this resilience capacity. So if you next time you're in Berlin, go there, trying to work this pump. It sometimes takes about 20 pushes, you have to really go for it, until the water comes out, and that's great, because the water comes out, you're keeping it operated, yeah? Really, really important function there. It's also used most recently for exploring underground ecologies. There's quite a few biologists, I think, in the room. So there you go. This is BUND as well. They have a kind of citizen science project going on now, and you can see the picture there. It's one of these street water pumps, and they've got various people taking samples from the water and discovering all sorts of interesting animals in the groundwater, and discovering also that the groundwater is warming up quite a lot. Which is very significant and quite problematic, actually, but that was kind of an unexpected find there. So these are all the sites in Berlin where they're doing this kind of stuff. So again, using these pumps for educational purposes, but also scientific purposes, and to give an insight into the important underground of the city. And perhaps most important of all, and perhaps most surprising of all, there is a huge amount of political interest in Berlin now in keeping these pumps going. And this interest has increased dramatically since 2022 for risks of military attack or whatever, but has been continuous throughout the 80s, 90s, 2000s, and the present day. What you can see here, you can't read them very well, sort of parliamentary questions to the Abgeordnetenhaus, the city-state parliament in Berlin, from all sorts of different parties, from the Greens here, from the CDU, from the SPD, and they're all asking questions about these pumps. What is the condition of these pumps? How many are there? Who is responsible for them? Who maintains them? Blah, 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 blah. And this has been going on continuously. So even when you thought there might be a peace dividend in 1990, where you might have expected they'll say, okay, 1990, it's all gone. No need to keep these silly things. We'll get rid of them. They were still kept, yeah, still kept. And this is really important now. So important that you've got here a picture, a photograph of the Bezirksstadtrat for Neukölln. So that's like the city councillor for Neukölln in his smart suit. Who likes to have a photo op showing that they've just maintained and reopened one of these street water pumps to show that it's operating again. It's really important. There is a program now they've just actually been taken over in April 2025 by the Berlin water utility. And there's a program for the water utility to check all these 2,091 pumps to see how many of them are operating. Currently, they think only about 2/3, maybe 3/4 of them are fully operable. And then to make sure that there is one of these pumps for 1,500 inhabitants across the whole city, which will involve building new pumps in parts of the city where there's new development, like in Pankow, for example. And everybody knows the water that comes out of these pumps cannot be drunk as it is, but in a crisis situation, we will be provided with purification tablets. That's all organized. And then you get purification tablets, you'd be told where the nearest pump is that you could use safely, and that's what you would do. And they calculate 15 litres per person per day from these pumps for essential water supply. And this is no joke. This is serious thinking, and this is why people, all the parties, are getting really, really interested in this. And what's really interesting about them, of course, they're an off-grid technology in a double sense. They're off-grid because they're not connected to the water mains at all. They only go straight down into the groundwater. So they're completely independent of the water mains, and they're off-grid in a second sense. They're completely independent of the electricity supply system. So if there is any cyber attack, if there is any, I don't know, huge climate crisis or climate event, if there is a military intervention which affects either or both the electricity supply system or the water supply system, these things will always be functioning because they function with muscle power only, okay? Really interesting. And so a redundant technology lives on. A technology that should have gone ages ago, because it no longer fulfills its original function, should have disappeared, was kept on for various historical reasons for multiple functionality. And today it's really important we have it. Yeah, it's the envy of lots of other cities that don't have these kind of things. Okay, right, what could we draw from lessons from all this stuff? Lessons on infrastructural resilience. I'm coming to the end of my talk now, you'll be relieved to hear. The first thing is infrastructural resilience was and is never just a material phenomenon. I hope I showed you that. Or a product of human agency alone, but always socio-technical. There's always a combination of the social and the technical. Now, resilience strategies often shifted. They were not put in stone. They shifted to reflect changing political, environmental, and sociocultural circumstances. So think of the shifting resilience strategy around electricity provision in West Berlin. Yeah, and they need to do that today. So we need to be thinking resilience strategies in terms of adapting them, changing them over perhaps in a very short space of time. How are we able to do that? The technologies enrolled could serve very different resilience practices over time. So if you told the designer of that original street water pump that they'd be used for watering trees or for washing cars, when they didn't even know what a car is, you know, they'd be completely astonished. So what technologies are we inventing now, we're implementing now? What functions will they be fulfilling in 50 years, in 100 years? Do we know that? We don't. But can we prepare for that? Perhaps we can. Infrastructural resilience reaches from the home via the neighborhood and city to nation states and geopolitics and back. So think through the resilience policy, strategies in terms of this multiscalarity. And finally, the legacies of past infrastructural resilience, such as fossil-based power systems that we're struggling with Berlin today, but also the street water pumps that create all sorts of new opportunities. They can be seen as strengths and weaknesses. And perhaps I'll just say a few words about this, but because my impression in Berlin is that these histories are not really being taken on board when we're thinking about futures. So this project that we're doing for the DFG, Past Proofing Infrastructure's Futures, is trying to engage stakeholders from the utilities, from the museums, from NGOs, environmental NGOs in particular, confronting them with some of these histories and asking how those histories could be used to help them navigate some of the challenges and the crises they're facing today. And we're deliberately setting this up not in a sense of me as a historian telling them these are the lessons, you know, X, Y, Z, that's the lessons, this is what you should be doing. But it's confronting them with some of this historical material and getting them to work out for themselves what they find useful. Yeah? So it's usable past, not in the sense of what I think is useful as a historian. Obviously, I do a lot of selection of material, think about the cases, but we're really organizing encounters with historical material and past events with these people to get them thinking through afresh. And this is really, really exciting. So I've had a number of workshops, interactive workshops, where we've got people working with historical material, like as you can see here, thinking through issues such as crises. One of the issues that came from them, because we asked them deliberately, one of the questions we asked in the first workshop was, what challenges are you facing now that you think historical reflection or historical knowledge could be helpful in navigating that? And one of the issues that came up was crises, which is really interesting. They said, how did they deal with crises in Berlin in the past? You know, Berlin's had a lot of crises. So that was something that we picked up, and we devised this workshop on past infrastructure visions out of a crisis. So visions that never came to pass, but were developed as a way of dealing with crises, constructed or real. And we've been using that, and people have found that really, really effective, and it's been really exciting working on that. And another thing that the street water pump also features, it's been picked up by people, because this story of the value today has been picked up. And it's actually going to feature in this exhibition in the Humboldt Labor that is opening tomorrow, which is why I can't be here tomorrow, because I have to be there. So again, there's interest in this kind of work and how you can use these historical cases to tease out notions of, well, in this case, resilience. So, last slides, implications for resilience research. Beyond presentism, I think, is my first message. We need to get beyond thinking about the present. So looking to the past can trace the roots and legacies of modern day resilience and offer a corrective to simplistic trajectories of resilience thinking. So we need to be sort of having not only the present and the future in our sights when thinking about resilience, but also the past. Beyond eventism, you know, we like to think of resilience as responding to crisis events, but a lot of the stories I've been telling, a lot of the work I've been doing is very much about the vulnerabilities that are less visible, but more prevalent in many ways, more expansive. And they're having below the radar of these globally mediated crises and national responses. So looking for the smaller stories that are perhaps more pervasive and more serious altogether. The third one is beyond essentialism. As we know, and Clemens was talking about this beforehand, resilience is not a given. It's not something that's out there to be discovered, you know. It depends on your perspective, nor is vulnerability. So the importance of treating resilience not only as something in a context-sensitive way, but as something that's relational, as something that's constructed. Yeah. So that's beyond essentialism. And finally, perhaps good in a sort of interdisciplinary setting here, beyond disciplining. And I like that word, disciplining, in the sense of, you know, sticking to your discipline, but also disciplining people, telling people what to do. So we need to consider, I think, you know, the legacies of our disciplinary divides for research and policy. So, you know, if I'm sort of over exaggerating the story, maybe how the natural sciences have framed the resilience discourse traditionally, how engineering sciences have given resilience material form, focusing on that, but also self-criticism, how the social sciences have focused on critique and often are not very keen on going beyond critique and saying what you can do constructively with this term. And I'll end with some shameless advertising. And this is the book that Sebastian kindly referred to. This is the project that I was referring to that we're doing now about usable past. But there are also some film material in German and English you can use maybe in teaching, called Invisible Berlin, where I go to various sites in Berlin infrastructure and talk to some of the stakeholders involved there. And we've also done a digital tour around Charlottenburg, around infrastructure sites that features the street water pumps. And with that, I will finish and say thank you very much for staying and listening. Thank you.